Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for the Northeast Summit on Climate Adaptation for Library Facilities. My name is Natalie McDonough. I'm with the New York State Library. I oversee the state library funding for public library construction. I'm joined by my colleagues at state library agencies throughout the Northeast, all the way from Maine to Maryland and Delaware. Today, this particular agenda program has been brought to you by Michelle Stricker at the New Jersey State Library, Deborah Clark at the Maine State Library, and myself. The way the day is going to run is we are kicking off with our keynote with Sean Birkel, who is the Maine State Climatologist. Sean is going to speak for roughly a half an hour or so. He will take questions at the end of his presentation. Please use the question and answer part of Zoom to ask questions. We will be keeping an eye on those during the presentation, and Dan will answer them at the end. After Sean's presentation, we're going to throw to a very quick clip of a video on what libraries have had to deal with extreme weather. The URL for the full YouTube video will be put as well in the chat, which will go out to all participants. And then we are going to have a panel of library staff who have had to deal with issues from libraries of varying sizes. But we're going to start with a quick note for future programs from the folks at the Northeast Summit. That is going to be the next event will be February 4th. And following that will be May 6th. So you will be getting an email from whichever listserv you learned about this particular program. And we encourage everyone to sign up. We're very pleased to have almost 500 people who signed up for today's webinar. So it's a good indication to us that this is a necessary and appreciated topic. I will now do a quick introduction for Sean and then throw it over to him. He is a research assistant professor and the Maine State Climatologist, and his research utilizes climate modeling and data visualization to better understand climate variability and future impacts from human activity. As the state climatologist, he provides climate and weather expertise to stakeholders and the general public to facilitate climate decision-making, policy, and planning. Since 2012, he's been developing data visualization through a website, climatereanalyzer.org. And in support of his role as the state climatologist, he's developing the Maine Climate Office and working with colleagues in Cooperative Extension to provide climate and weather data to Maine farmers. He also serving on the scientific and technical subcommittee of the Maine Climate Council, and has graduate students working on a variety of projects such as large-scale teleconnections to extreme precipitation in the northeastern U.S., sensitivity of the weather research and forecasting model in simulating ice storms, comparison of global reanalysis models, and linkages between changes in atmospheric circulation and mass balance on the Greenland ice sheet. Sean, I will throw to you.
Well, thank you, Natalie, and good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to spend the next few minutes giving you an overview of climate and weather extremes in the Northeast. And where I'm the Maine State Climatologist, I beg your forgiveness, there are quite a few examples from Maine, but I've also tried to put this in a broader regional context. And I will now share my screen. Let's see. Natalie, do you see my screen?
I do. I see that you've got a PowerPoint
Great.
There.
Ordinarily, there's a green box on the screen that is showing. That didn't happen this time. And now, do you see the full screen?
Yes, it looks great.
Great. Okay, thanks. Okay. For a brief outline, First, I'll cover temperature and precipitation trends, and then work into a discussion on how the warming climate in the region is leading towards shorter winters and a longer growing season. And we'll see how the impacts of warming affect the entire growing season, just for some context. And then move on to increased weather extremes, why more weather extremes are happening, and some examples. We're all becoming more and more familiar with examples of extreme weather events, including heavy rainfall, windstorms, flood damage, storm surge flooding along the coast. And along the way, I'll try to frame this in such a way to spur ideas for how these events are impacting libraries. And then the final slide has a couple of resources that may be of interest. And items to consider just offhand, some things that come to mind in terms of impacts that libraries will probably already have been and will increasingly serve a role in providing community refuge during weather disruptions or disasters, serving as cooling, or in the case of say if there was a severe storm in the winter, cooling or warming centers. Also providing internet access during outage events. I presume that many of you folks have already served that role. And also how to protect assets from humidity or water damage if there's flooding or roof leaks in heavy precipitation events. And another issue that sometimes missed is mold, that in a more humid climate, especially in northern New England, with more humid summers, it's there, and also rainfall, that if there's a leak that goes undetected in basements or whatnot, that can lead to a situation where there's mold and might require remediation. So I just figured I would put those up potentially to spur conversation. And now on to some charts. I try to have a balance between data charts and photographs. Now, this example, this is for Maine, but it is broadly applicable to the entire Northeast region. The climate across the region is getting warmer and wetter, and we're seeing more extremes. The panels on the right show the annual average increase in temperature since 1895. This again is for Maine, but the signal is very similar if we average it across the Northeast region. And there's considerable year-to-year variability, as well as decade or sub-decade scale variability, shown here in the black line. But there's an overall warming trend that we're all becoming increasingly familiar with. And in this case, for Maine, there's been about a 3.5 degree Fahrenheit warming over this period since 1895. And that's on a linear trend, again, acknowledging that there's variability superimposed on that. And in terms of precipitation, the Northeast region is getting wetter overall. That's on, again, if we were to take a linear trend for annual precipitation, the increase works out to be about 6 inches since 1895, again, with considerable variability, both on the annual timescale as well as decadal or sub-decadal. And when we look into the future using climate models that project to 2050 or 2100, we find that in general, depending on the scenario of emissions, we can see anywhere from a 2 to 10 degree Fahrenheit warming mean annually in terms of the absolute increase. That's the expected range by 2100. And for precipitation, the increase is more on the order of between 5 and 14 or 15% increase, meaning that by the year 2100, in a warmer, wetter climate, the increased annual rainfall would on average be about up to close to 15% more than now. Now, there is, of course, uncertainty in these projections, which we must be mindful of, but in general, those are the trends. And now, in terms of the temperature annual cycle, I think this is a very important aspect of the warming climate because on the one hand, when I said that Maine's annual climate has increased by about 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit, again, that's broadly applicable to the region. 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit might not sound like much, but when we consider the impacts with the annual cycle, and when we consider how that impacts the length of the winter season versus the length of the warm season, then we begin to see how ecosystems are impacted, and which then in turn impacts the human economy, whether it's outdoor recreation or natural resources. So this chart here shows a comparison of 3 average temperature climates. These are on the monthly time scale. The curve at the bottom here in blue is for a 100-year average, and this is from data from NOAA for Maine, again, broadly applicable across the region, but will differ depending on southern sites versus more northern sites. But this blue line here, if we compare it with a more recent climate average or climatology from 2010 to 2023, we can see that in the spring and fall seasons, there's a relative lengthening of the time for which the average temperature goes above freezing. And so this, of course, has a close association to either the end or onset of winter. Now, likewise, if we look at this curve in dark red, this is for average conditions projected for the year 2050. And we can see that over the past little more than a century, there's been approximately a two-week overall lengthening of the warm season. And it's especially apparent up here if we were to use the 50-degree Fahrenheit line as a proxy for a basis for establishing when the growing season would be. You see that there's a little more increase on the fall, in late summer into the fall. But nonetheless, the overall point is that the winters in terms of snow and ice cover are getting shorter, especially in the southern reaches of the region, in which there are some years where there's very little snowfall that does not last on the ground very long. That's also having a big impact in the northern part of the region as well. So that links to decreasing snowpack, earlier snow melt, earlier spring runoff, impacts on lake ice, and then in the fall has an impact on the longer that summer-like weather persists, a greater likelihood of heat waves that can impact into September and October, and also has linkage to whether or not there's drought. And I don't want to get into too many details in that regard, but the bottom line here is that the change in the annual cycle linked to warming is very important. Now, this chart here gives you a sense for the projections that we're talking about in terms of there's a spread of physically plausible outcomes depending on greenhouse gas emissions, where the blue line indicates the best case scenario in which there's significant action taken versus the worst case scenario in which warming is considerable due to inaction. And now if we go from just the data chart, now looking at a map to try to visualize, well, what does that mean in terms of how, say if we wanted to find a location on the map where, again, I'm focused on Maine here, but if we consider that the current growing season length in coastal Maine for the last 30 years on average, by 2100, in the worst case scenario, the growing season would warm such that it'd be much more comparable to what we would find on Long Island, New York today. So now you can see that the physical distance, imagine that shift in terms of the temperature as in a warming climate, the warm temperatures are proceeding northward. And so there'd be a comparable shift in latitude for other areas as well. Now, it also can help in terms of if you're planning out 20 or 30 years to see what others are doing to the south in terms of how are their operations different from more northern operations and so on. Now we're moving towards extreme events and how warming facilitates extreme, more intense rainfall, for example, and also more intense storms. Links back to what we call the hydrologic cycle, which is the overall cycle of water that is evaporated from the oceans and trained into the atmosphere and eventually becomes or gets precipitated out through cloud formation and then either rainfall or snowfall, and then back to the terrestrial landscape into lakes and rivers, and then back out to the sea. Warming intensifies this overall cycle of evaporation, transfer to the atmosphere, and then precipitation to the land. Warming also increases, by increasing the evaporation, there's also increased humidity, and warmer air can hold more water vapor than drier air. And as noted down here, the water holding capacity of air increases by about 7% for a 1 degree C of warming. And that's that is a 1.8 degree Fahrenheit warming. So a warmer atmosphere holds more water. And that is in turn related to this increase in heavy precipitation events. Atmospheric circulation plays a role as well, and we'll talk about that. First, I want to show this slide. This is a graphic from the 5th National Climate Assessment that was released late last year. This gives examples of state and local responses to extreme weather, including climate action plans that have been released. Vermont, for example, Maine also has a climate action plan that's been developed, and Hurricane Ida that impacted New York City recently, that led to the New Normal report, and various action plans and resources have been allocated in response to these recent very impactful events, including this example here, also for Vermont in terms of recent extremely damaging flood events. I want to note that in addition to weather scale extremes, we can also see seasonal scale extremes. And there's a recent, a very interesting example here in Maine, where in 2020, we experienced the driest growing season on record. So that's a period roughly from May through September. And then 3 years later, we experienced the second wettest growing season. And both seasons posed significant challenges. On the one hand, drought, especially to the agricultural community. Water resources were running dry, significant impacts there. There was also emergency declarations. And in 2023, there was almost too much water, and fields were wet, crops were rotting or inaccessible. So two very different seasons, but they both pose challenges, in an example of seasonal scale extremes that we must manage. And now bringing that back to libraries, in 2023, anywhere that was impacted by the heavy rainfall that occurred repeatedly during that year, that's another very important matter. Heat waves. This figure, which is also from the 5th National Climate Assessment and the Northeast Regional Climate Center, it shows heat wave characteristics from 50 large cities in the US. Unfortunately, there's nothing showing in the northern Northeast, but New England, I should say, except for the southern region. However, so the average number of heat waves per year has been increasing since the 1960s, especially since the 2010s, as well as the length of the heat wave season. So bringing that back to the change in the seasonal cycle. Warm season is longer, and there's more opportunity for heat waves to carry later into the year or to begin earlier. And now we get to heavy precipitation and flooding. This figure over here, which is from the previous National Climate Assessment, highlights that the Northeast region has seen the largest increase in 99th percentile precipitation events. So those are the very, are what historically have been the rare but extreme precipitation events. So the 1% events at the very top, and which tend to be the most impactful. And this ties into a couple slides ago, Hurricane Ida, which had major impact in parts of New Jersey and the New York City area. The rainfall totals here that at Newark, for example, 8.41 inches of rainfall associated with this storm. Now, at this time, it was the extratropical remnants of Hurricane Ida. But even though it wasn't a hurricane at that time, the amount of water that can fall as precipitation in these events causes significant damage that we are all seeing more and more of. And now for an example in Maine from a couple of years ago, there was a 5-inch rainfall event that had large impacts across the state, including infrastructure damage, road damage, and this also carried wind, and there was a large power outage in the state. The rainfall actually occurred within about a 12-hour period, but this is showing daily measurements, and the rainfall occurred overnight. So it shows here as a 1.8 and a 3.2 inch event, but in total it was about 5 inches. And that was a very impactful event. To give you an idea of what it looks like when we consider how the annual number of precipitation events, say, for example, 1 inch per day events per given year, or 2 inch per day per given year, 3 inch per day, and so on, by using station data that go back to the early 1950s and observing from these 5 long-term stations listed up here, we can then calculate the trends and to see what the station data are showing in terms of how many more days on average are we seeing with 1 inch, 2 inch, or 3 inch precipitation days. Now, I should note that the more southern areas of the Northeast region, they tend to have more high precipitation events than the northern areas in Maine. But overall, if we look at the 5-site average with this black trend line here, the dark blue trend line here versus the light blue trend line, there's an increase in between about 2 to over 3 of these events per year. And for the 2 inch per day events, we're seeing between 1 and 2 more per year. Now, 2 inches of rainfall starts to produce local impacts, especially depending on the precipitation rate. For the 3 inch per day events, we're not seeing as much of a rise here in Maine, but still impactful. And there are a number of in recent years, including that 5-inch event that I noted. And now moving on to recent studies. This is from the First Street Foundation, which did an assessment of what's called looking at precipitation data and pairing that with a flood model that's been developed, and to see how flooding may become more or less of a concern in the future. I shouldn't say less of a concern. Flooding is becoming more of a concern. And this particular study utilized station data and paired it with information from how things will be changing in the future to find that the existing atlas from NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, there's an atlas that estimates precipitation frequencies for given events. And the overall findings are that the current atlas needs to be updated to account for the warming climate in which we'll be seeing more heavy precipitation events. And ultimately, the findings are, at least tentatively, that the return rates for certain events seem to be much currently underrepresented, or not as in the future. For example, a 1 in 100 year event could be more like a 1 in 20 year event, is the bottom line. And we are seeing examples of how these very impactful precipitation events that we would not expect to see for 100 years have actually happened in a much, much shorter duration. Now, to pull us back into atmospheric circulation, I want to note that oftentimes when we experience an extreme weather event here in the Northeast region, it can be associated with a buildup in the jet stream or an overall pattern that's linked to extremes elsewhere on the continent. This is an example from the very late part of October, early November of 2019, in which a large meandering jet stream in a blocking pattern in the central part of the continent produced a cold wave down to Texas, warm wave up into Alaska, and then as well as on the East Coast. Now, the extreme weather events in particular on the East Coast, we experienced a strong bomb cyclone that produced strong winds, and in northern New England, a powerful windstorm. And on the West Coast, there were strong Santa Ana winds over Northern California associated with this pattern, and that facilitated among the largest wildland fires on record. Now, that was paired with electrical equipment that was damaged, but the strong winds and this extreme setup in the jet stream facilitated the spread of that fire. And so again, extremes on both sides of the continent. Three more examples. 2017, a strong cyclone, October 30th, high winds gusting around 70 miles per hour in some areas, 500,000 power outages in Maine, and for a small state, that's very significant. And then in 2019, there were two cyclones within 2 weeks of each other that were also high outage events, major events in the state. And there are other examples throughout the region as well. And I would like to note that Maine was very recently strongly impacted on December 18, as well as January 10 and January 13. 3 major storms in less than a month. And as you can see here on these items, these were all storms that produced strong southeasterly winds. There was gust potential over 50 miles per hour across much of the state for several hours. In the December 18 event, 5 to 7 inches of rainfall, depending on where in the state. The western portions and into New Hampshire received the highest totals. The worst flooding along the Kennebec and Androscoggin rivers in almost 40 years. And then with 3 of these storms in a row, the coast especially had a compound of impacts associated with storm surge flooding, weakening infrastructure, and then a few days later or a couple weeks later, being hit by another storm. And so this was a major set of storms in Maine's history and led to disaster declarations. And these storms are often associated with atmospheric rivers, which we don't see so much on the East Coast. Oftentimes we hear about them on the West Coast. Atmospheric rivers can form on the East Coast, and some of these recent events are atmospheric rivers in which there's a large plume of moisture in which the circulation pattern involving low pressure system associated with the storm and strong high pressure system. High pressure circulates clockwise, low pressure counterclockwise. And when there's a steep gradient between the two, that can drive very intense circulation and pull intense plumes of tropical moisture into our region. And the December 18 event is the one that's shown here. And this map is just showing the significance of this was by all measures an extreme event. Sea level rise for communities along the coast. This is becoming a major concern with an increase in nuisance flooding. So that's with the high tide that tends to occur on the lunar cycle that may just have localized flooding, but not cause too many problems unless it's paired with a storm, for example. So the January storms along the Maine coast coincided with high tide and produced some of the record storm surge flooding. And here's a photograph from the January 13 storm. And but also impacting the coast of Massachusetts, anywhere along the Gulf of Maine, there is an overall background variability of sea level rise, as shown here. These measurements are from Portland, but you can see that there's significant annual variability. And the two highest years are 2010 and 2023. But those were peaks. Now that's variability associated with, at the large scale, patterns across the North Atlantic that tend to either push more or less water mass into the Gulf of Maine. And so the large scale patterns, that the wind patterns, as well as circulation of the Gulf Stream, work together, that in 2010 and 23 produced a very high background sea level. And so if there is a storm event on top of that, and then paired with high tide with strong winds in this overall background, that can be especially damaging. And now I just want to say a few things about storm projections, and then there'll be the final slide with a couple of resources to share. Storm projections: heavy precipitation events are becoming more common, and that's documented with station data. And this is due to an intensification of the hydrologic cycle. Climate models project that this trend will continue as the atmosphere is warmer and more humid. There's greater potential for rainfall. And so we can expect that storms in the future will be, they'll have more impacts associated with being more intense, especially in terms of having more associated rainfall. Extratropical cyclones, those are storms that form roughly between October through April. Those are also expected to become more intense and with more rainfall, but it's uncertain whether or not they'll become more or less common. So the overall frequency, that is how many times in a given year these occur, climate models are not yet in agreement if we in terms of the frequency. And that relates to disagreement in how the North Atlantic storm track will change over time. And as I alluded to before, sea level rise is a threat multiplier. So coastal sites in particular have important decisions and adaptation measures to take to secure infrastructure from future storms and sea level rise. So now getting to a couple of resources. The U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit has a number of tools within to assess, to understand exposure to hazards and to assess vulnerability, tools to assist with that, and also to help set up and prioritize a plan for how to approach the overall step of resilience for different aspects of infrastructure. And there's also the climate mapping for resilience and adaptation tool. This is through climate, both of these are through climate.gov. And this shows you the overall setup and pathway to make a resilience plan. There are also tools for assessing various aspects, and there are resources that help link up people to federal funding to assist with this. And I'd also like to note that for your individual states, there's also the state climate offices who can provide additional resources and help link people with resources in other organizations that may be able to help. And there are also the regional climate centers. And in our region, there's the Northeast Regional Climate Center. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions. And thank you.
Thank you, Sean. That was wonderful. I think that's a perfect example of why we are doing programs like this, is the needs that libraries are going to have to deal with moving forward. If people have any questions, please put them in the question and answer section, and we will take them. And then we'll move on to our panel.
Well, seeing none, thank you. And please feel free to reach out. I turn my screen share off, but my email address is Birkel, BIRKEL @maine.edu. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. We're going to move on now to our panel. I'm going to do a brief introduction to all of our panelists, and then we're going to go, each panelist is going to have roughly 10 minutes to talk about their library. We're going to go in size of libraries. But before we do that, we're going to show you a quick clip of a video about the Queens Library and the Superstorm Sandy. I'm also going to put a link to that YouTube URL directly in the chat, where I've also put some of the other links. And we will not throw the entire video out there. It's about 4.5 minutes, but it is very useful information. So let me see if I can share my screen and bring that up for you. Okay, if somebody could let me know.
I see it.
Okay.
When something like this happens, I don't care where it is, people have a tendency, I believe, to lose hope, especially when nobody's answering questions, especially when there's nowhere to go to get answers. So nobody knew where to go, what to do, what services were available. You had people with no water, no heat.
There was no power in our apartment. There is no heat, and there is, of course, well, no water.
It was chaos down there at that point, with people looking for information and just trying to find out, where they could find loved ones, trying to have prescriptions filled. That Saturday, right after the storm, our Far Rockaway Library opened up without power, without heat, without lights, without anything, with our manager who was down there with her staff.
So this is a good indication of the type of situation that libraries have had to deal with. Okay, our first panelist is going to be Amy Stone. She's the director of the Bridgeton Public Library in Bridgeton, Maine. She is a Maine native and has traveled to other parts of the world and has come back to Maine and has experience with public, special, and school libraries. And she has found her happy place at the Bridgeton Public Library, where she has worked since 2016. And she is serving a population of roughly 5,700 people. So Amy, I will throw to you.
Thank you, Natalie. I do have a slide deck, so I will share my screen. Okay. And so I'm at the Bridgeton Public Library in Bridgeton, Maine. We are located on the edge of Cumberland County. We are about half an hour from the New Hampshire border and about an hour north of Portland. Our area is small and rural, and the community that we serve is actually outside of Bridgeton as well. But that's our technical service area. So about our library today. Well, so we have 5,825 square feet, 2 floors of equal size with a mezzanine entrance. Our estimated current population is 5,725 people, which is a 6% increase in a 2-year period. We are located on the corner of Main Street and Church Street and less than 50 yards from beautiful Stevens Brook and Pondicherry Park. We are on the National Register of Historic Places. We are listed as the Dalton Holmes Davis Memorial Library, which was added to the register in 1989. Our original building was completed in 1913. So I want to be clear, I love my library and I love the building. It is a reminder of the grace of design of a century past. However, one of our 2 floors is in fact a finished basement. Our estimated current population is growing, and we are seeing a lot of new young families moving into the area. We love our location on the corner of Maine and Church, and the proximity to Stevens Brook. Stevens Brook is a protected watershed. We love our building, but our building has a flat membrane roof in keeping with the original roof design. And because we are on the National Register, we cannot change the exterior of the original building unless it is for safety reasons. So what we experienced today. Well, we are at the bottom of a paved street with a steep pitch. Water comes down in sheets, which then collects in our paved parking lot. We have beautiful old growth trees that drop seeds and leaves into our catch basins. These block water from seeping into the ground. We have youth services in our basement, which is the lowest point of the building, and flooding occurs at the emergency exit door that is required for egress. The only permeable surface we have on our entire property is our rain garden and some landscaping on each side of the building. Our water runs off to Stevens Brook, a protected watershed. Our elevator pit is at the lowest point of 3 converging hills. And we have an oil burning furnace that provides central heat using ductwork from our original coal burning furnace from 1913. So what we are planning for? We are planning for renovation and expansion to address space and engineering issues. We are planning to move youth services out of the basement and bring it up to above grade to use natural light, solar heat, and heat pumps. We will be removing paved parking lot and adding permeable landscaped surface around the building footprint. We'll be using heat pumps to heat and cool our existing building. And we are designing the roof for the expansion to accommodate solar panels that our original building roof membrane cannot support. One of the most important reasons for moving youth services out of the basement is the flooding that has occurred. When we have flooding in youth services, it saturates the carpet, it ruins the bookshelves, we have to physically move the collections, we have to remediate for mold, we have to replace the carpet, replace the bookshelves, and ensure that our books are safe. This has happened 3 times since I've been here, and I've not been here for many years. It is becoming much more urgent to get youth services out of the basement and bring it up to above grade to use natural light, solar heat, and heat pumps is our most important objective of the renovation that we are planning. And so this is the new design. You can see that on the right-hand side, oops, sorry, here we go. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see the original building with the flat roof and the brick. And then the renovation and expansion will extend backwards. We are going to be removing parking lot and replacing it with permeable surface that is landscaped. We will be reducing the number of parking spaces that we have available, which we know will be an issue. We have a lot that is private property. We are our own 501c3 nonprofit, and we may consider posting it that is for public library use only, but at this time it is not posted. And so these are the ways that we may fund it. The U.S. Department of Energy is offering their Renew America's Nonprofits. Because we are a separate 501c3, we cannot apply for a lot of the federal grant money that has been made available to government and municipal agencies. However, with this program as specifically designed for nonprofits, we are considering completing an application. The U.S. Department of Agriculture, their Rural Development Office, state level offices will connect and support you. And then Efficiency Maine. Efficiency Maine is specific to the state of Maine. It is a trust that is quasi-state agency governed by a board of trustees with oversight from the Maine Public Utilities Commission. So you may want to check with your state public utility governing body to see if there is something like this in your state. Efficiency Maine offers rebates and tax incentives for a wide variety of projects involving improving the efficiency of heating, lighting, and cooling. And then we will be pursuing family foundations and individual donors. And that is all that I have. So let me see if I can stop sharing my screen and open it up to any questions that anyone might have.
Thank you, Amy. That's very helpful information. If there's any questions, you can leave them for Amy. And we will, if there are none come right up, we'll move on to our next two presenters who are from the Kellogg Hubbard Library. Dan Groberg is the executive director of the Kellogg Hubbard Library. He's worked in community and economic development in central Vermont for more than a decade. And some of you may have seen an article that Dan wrote for American Libraries this month called Picking Up the Pieces. Joining him is Carolyn Picazio, who is the Director of Library Services at the Kellogg Hubbard Library, and she has worked in a variety of administrative positions in Vermont libraries for more than 12 years, and their service population is roughly 17,000 people. So Dan and Carolyn, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I also have a presentation, so let me just share my screen here. See if I can get that going. Great. Yes, so about our library.
Yeah, we're also a 501c3 nonprofit. So about a third of the libraries in Vermont are nonprofits and are not municipal government entities. Our library serves 6 communities. So we serve the city of Montpelier, which is about 8,000 people, and then 5 surrounding towns. So we have a mix of some very rural residents and some that live in the town center. So our total population served is approaching 18,000, but it hasn't quite gotten there yet. Our beautiful building was built in 1895. And then we added an addition in 2000, and it was interesting to hear about the previous library because that addition was built here to bring our children's library out of our basement and to protect it against historic flooding. So our library flooded in 1927 for the Great Flood in Vermont, and then again in 1992, and then it flooded catastrophically last summer in 2023 in July. Our total building is about 18,000 square feet, And you can see we have a little map here showing that our building is just less than a block from the north branch of the Winooski River. And then all of downtown Montpelier is at the confluence of the north branch of the Winooski and the Winooski River itself. And so we have significant downtown flooding events that now the city is building resilience against. So we have a video here, and that's a couple minutes long. And this is an overview of the flooding that happened in the city in July. So this was July 10th and 11th of 2023. And so we are looking, we're heading towards the State House. And so the library building is not
here,
actually
but
in
we
there.
are we are just off to the bottom right corner of this, and we won't show the whole thing, but you can get a sense of how the town and river were one, basically. And you can also see Montpelier is essentially a bowl surrounded by the Green Mountains, with the downtown along the river, like, you know, historic industrial downtowns built along the riverfront. And let me see if it will let me actually get to the next slide. There we go.
There we go. So then this is a view at about 3 p.m. on the day after the flooding last year. So you can see where the sign of the library is, and that's our view from basically our side lawn. This is another short video that shows the day of that flood. This is again 3 p.m. the afternoon. The river crested just after midnight the previous night, and this is what it looked like when we opened our door for the first time to try to go in and assess the damage post-flooding. And this is the damage that we found. So
the good news is that none of our collections were damaged because we didn't have any collections in our basement, but our big fundraising book sale, which is about $30,000 a year in revenue, was in the basement, along with a meeting room, and then a lot of expensive stuff that runs a big old building. So our elevator controls, all our electrical systems, our security systems, our sprinkler and fire alarm systems, hot water, heat. We had 2 oil tanks that floated and spilled, and our heating system, our network infrastructure. All in all, about $2 million worth of damage. This is just a picture looking into our electrical room. The water was basically just below that light there, about 7.5 feet of water, and the ceilings are between 8 and 8.5 feet. So basically all the way up to the ceiling. And this is just showing we had about 150 volunteers come the weekend after the flood and help get all of those book sale books out of the basement with a bucket brigade and pile them up on the lawn. You can see our historic building from 1898 on the left side, and then the addition starting sort of at the glassy part.
And so then we had a continuity of operations plan that had been developed predominantly during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we were able to resume library services very quickly, but under kind of, extreme conditions. So we had curbside pickup, which we should be pretty familiar with, operating 1 week post-flood. Now we had emergency provisional electricity entering the building. So we had 1 circulation computer that we could power up from an electrical panel that looked more like a home electrical panel than a commercial industrial one that we're used to. And it was under a tent outside the window, and we were running extension cords into the building to power our network infrastructure so that people could file FEMA claims and access our Wi-Fi. We believed it was very important to have our Wi-Fi available and a public computer available for people to use who needed to access emergency services. And then we had our outreach and home delivery program going. Our summer reading program, we very quickly found partner organizations that were on higher ground and moved all of our programs off-site. And then our building was secure and we still had water, so we were able to offer a public bathroom just inside our foyer for folks. So we got up and going to provide stability and resources for our community just as quickly as we possibly could. And we worked under these conditions for several months.
And you can see the photo here of one of our librarians accessing our collection using headlamps, since most of our buildings still didn't have lights or electricity until early October. So mid-July until early October. And looking at rebuilding, so we did have a flood insurance policy, although it was only $400,000. It's something to think about with construction getting more and more expensive. But one thing that's actually nice about Montpelier is that they did have the foresight to put into the zoning and building regulations that if you're in a floodplain, you do need, and you do substantial renovations or new construction, that you have to move those systems up, which means that FEMA has to pay for that. So we're working with FEMA Public Assistance, and it's been a long process working with architects and engineers trying to figure out how to move all of these systems up in this old, historic building. So we do plan to move all our main electrical distribution panel above the flood elevation, as well as our air handler systems, our elevator machine room, all of that up. We're also going to use, we decided that we could not fully give up use of the basement just because, it was very well used for the book sale and meeting rooms, but we're planning to use impermeable materials in the rebuild, including we're going to have some really nice small format meeting rooms with glass walls. The goal being that in the event of a future flood, that we can recover more quickly, essentially wipe off the glass and move on. We found that our emergency procedures were really lacking and not designed for the types of situations that we're actually seeing. So updating our policies to be really actionable and based on data of, here's what the river is expected to do, here's what you need to do in that situation to minimize damage, including one of our more expensive building components is our heating system. And there's actually a way that you can unscrew some parts and literally carry them upstairs. And had we done that, it would have saved about $100,000 in this situation. Also thinking about flexible work situations, getting rid of our on-site server and having cloud server, both for protection of our backups and archives and to enable remote work. And then thinking about what our insurance is and making sure that we're properly insured. So one of the things we plan to do is look at our main policy on the building and have an independent appraisal of the building and make sure that we're appraised for the right amount, because one of the things we realized was that the costs were a lot higher than we were expecting them to be when it actually comes to construction. So and thinking about whether we have the right policies in place to cover all sorts of scenarios. An example being that we're on an earthquake fault line and just recently added earthquake insurance to our coverage. So I'll stop sharing there and we are happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Dan and Carolyn. Very useful, helpful information. Unfortunate to have to go through it all to come out the other side to get information, but we appreciate it very much. One question came up is, how did the staff react to the working conditions that they are dealing with in the dark?
So our staff, they were great, as a matter of fact. They were all in, they were eager to come back to work and really help people out. So we have a really mission-oriented staff. We're a pretty small staff. There's 12 full and part-time librarians and like peripheral staff. And everybody remembered the lessons of the pandemic. So when we said, hey guys, we're switching over to curbside and this is how we're going to do it. I had actually for the first few days, it was Dan and I and our building guy in the library, and we were the only people there. And I had staff saying, "Can I come in? Can I come in? Can I help? What can I do? Just tell me what you need." And we had to kind of hold them off until we put a plan together and could safely bring them back into the building, and get back to work.
Okay, great. The next question is what's the projected completion date of the rebuild?
It's a great question.
Well, we're hoping January of 25, so about 6 more months. The other piece that I didn't address is that we're hoping to use, waiting to hear about some other funding from the Vermont Department of Libraries, and hoping to use this as an opportunity to make some other improvements while we already have a contractor on site and the building sort of torn apart. The biggest one is that we don't have climate control system in the building. So both for the collections, and then, Sean was speaking about how our summers are getting longer and hotter, and our building already sometimes gets up to 85 degrees in the summer, and thinking about adding air conditioning as long as we're making changes to the HVAC system. Oops, you're muted now.
Thank you. You've sort of touched on this a little bit, but one of the questions is what type of funding beyond insurance are you using for the upgrades?
Yeah, so the work strictly to recover from the flood, because of the fact that the city had these guidelines in place that when you're restoring after a flood, you had to make certain improvements, that has to be covered by FEMA as part of the rebuild. So we're mostly working with FEMA public assistance. We also did get several $100,000 of donations, both restricted and unrestricted donations after the flood, from really around the world. And so that is helping as well. And then like I said, we're waiting on this Vermont Department of Libraries grant.
Okay. And the last question, then we'll move on to our next panelist, and we'll have time later if need be. Was there an emergency preparedness manual in place at the time? And if not, have you drafted one with your staff input? I think you've talked a little bit about this, but if you want to provide more detail.
Yeah, so we did have a flood procedure in place because of the history of flooding at the library. And but that procedure was really written long after the last experience of flooding. And so we had lost institutional knowledge, and we didn't exactly know what event we were preparing for. So it said things like, make sure everybody's out. It had things about like securing the staff, getting folks safely home, and raising furniture and supplies and things at least 3 feet off of the basement floor. And then this event went so beyond when turning off the power to the building. So we did have a procedure in place that we did follow, but it was insufficient for the severity of this event. And so we are now using more data now that we have a better understanding and are working with emergency management to say, well, when the river gets to 17.5 feet, that means significant downtown flooding, and here's what you should do. So now we have a better, we've used that data to create a better emergency procedure so that when we do this next time, we will be much better off.
Okay, great. Thank you both very much for sharing with us. Our third presenter is Ann Thomas, who is the director at the Louis B. Goodall Memorial Library in Sanford, Maine. She's worked in various library roles from Massachusetts to Maine over the past 24 years and is an advocate and activist for library staff, patrons, and building and resource maintenance. And she believes when groups work together to learn, help, and provide a caring environment, we all enrich our communities. And Ann's library serves a population of roughly 22,000. So Ann, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Natalie. I also have some slides to share. Let's see. Right. Can you see my screen?
Not yet.
Okay. All right.
I can see it now, Ann.
Thank you. Right. So the Louis B. Goodall Memorial Library is in Sanford on the corner of Main Street and Elm Street. Sanford is in York County. We're about an hour south of Portland and about 16 miles west of Wells. And as you saw in Sean's presentation, Wells just really got hit with the weather damage this past year. We also serve, since we're a small urban library, we serve all the situations that accompany that setting. And thankfully, the former director, Chip Schrader, in 2021 started planning with the city and board members a renovation that will make our library 15,634 square feet. We have 5 full-time and 5 part-time staff with hourly cleaning and custodian assistance. This project was funded mostly through HUD community project funding, which is discretionary funding through the congressional offices. And I want to thank Senator Collins' office and Senator King's office and Shelley Pingree for all the hard work they did to make this happen, and Assistant Director Nicole Clark and I really, it was a lot of work to get the funding, but I'll tell you what, it is worth it. And we're really happy that we'll be updating electrical and lighting, computer network cabling, new insulation in the ceilings and the walls in our 1976 portion of the building. We are on the National Historic Register because we have a 1937 original part of the building, which is our children's room. And it'll be also a young adult section, and there's an office in that section. We have an energy efficient Marvin window section that I'll show you a slide of shortly. The slate roof repairs in conjunction with masonry work because the building was plagued with water leaks throughout the years. We'll be doing elevator updates, storm drain updates to divert water away from the city of Sanford storm drains, and the children's reading garden space next to the side entrance. As Amy Stone mentioned, having that green space next to the library is so important for water drainage. So I'm really happy that that Chip and Nicole had foresight to plan on that. We'll be having an expanded geothermal heating added into the new space. This library, L.B. Goodall, had geothermal installed in the early 2000s. So they've been forward thinking and continue to do so. We have added community and staff workspaces in the new addition, and some safety systems will be updated for fire. And this is a picture of the in progress before we put in the new windows in the side portion of the 1976 section of the building. The children's garden will be over here. This will all be glassed in, just as the Kellogg Hubbard Library was talking about using glass. And then upstairs here, this is where the reference room will be. These are the new windows that are going to mitigate heat and cooling loss. So since we are a warming center and a center people come to in the summer to stay cool, it's really important that we updated this. And the insulation has, as you can see up here, it's all being replaced with newer insulation. So that'll be helpful. This is the side entrance view. This is a 1976 portion of the building designed by Barbet and Wheelock architects. And it's just, the artist rendering shows the areas I mentioned, the children's garden, the side entrance it's glassed in. So we're really looking forward to this being finished. Hopefully we'll be moving in by June of this coming year. This is a photo of the 1937 portion of the building. It has a slate roof. These are the parapets, and this is where a lot of the leaking was happening. Water was hitting the parapet and running down the side all the way through into the children's room here. So that's been repaired now by a mason and our slate roof specialist. They added flashing and repointed bricks. The next portion of the project is going to involve the roof ridge. So that'll be shored up better than it is. This is where we're temporarily operating out of now at 1364 Main Street. It's a shopping plaza with a flat roof. And like Amy was talking about in her presentation, these flat roofs are just not great during rain and snow and ice storms. And what happened to us this past March and April, we had the storm that just did all this damage. Not as bad as Cala Hubbard, but for us it was traumatic. And it we had ServPro come in, the ceiling tiles fell, we lost books. Alan Fecteau came from the state library and brought dehumidifiers down so that we didn't have to pay ServPro for longer than 3 days. We didn't know how we were going to be paying for that. So thank you to that Maine State Librarian, Lori Fisher. And this is the staff coming together. This is 2 of our staff helping cover books because we were due to get another storm after that, that last bit in March. April, we got socked again. So I just want to recommend if you have storm damage, an action plan for storm damage, you should have a copy accessible at all times. So if you do need to have those numbers handy, you'll have them. Safety first is really the best way to go because you want to make sure that everyone's safe before you enter the building, and keep a journal or log and take photos to document the events. Notify your insurance agent if applicable. We were really lucky to have Liberty Mutual and a great agent who helped us through this. Use a spreadsheet to keep track of expenses and reimbursements. Have a list of people to call for help, and keep the public informed. So, Facebook and newspapers, radio, all are really helpful outlets to use to keep everyone updated. Have supplies to mitigate additional damage. So we had storm waterproof sheeting, tubs to collect water, and dehumidifiers set up. And then before reopening, just make sure that it's safe and sustainable. We did a partial opening and hold pickups, which turned out to be really helpful for people. Also, you want to have a toolkit to mitigate water and damage and humidity damage. When I worked at Friend Library in Brooklyn, we had water in the basement. That was 2022, just like Sean was talking about. That was such a wet year, and we had basement flooding. So the digital hydrometer helped us we could see how much humidity was in the air because we were finding moldy books. We had dehumidifiers set up in the library that we emptied daily. Maybe if you have the water coming from the ceiling, you want to have plastic sheeting. You want to have plastic tubs to collect water. If you have a sump pump for the basement for water removal, you may also want to consider getting a generator if you don't have one, because if you lose power, the sump pump won't work, and that's really a bummer. So those are just some of the things that I have to share that were helpful in the situations I've been in the different libraries.
Thank you, Ann. That's very helpful. Some things people may think of, but other things they may think, oh, I didn't. That's a good idea. And backup generators for the sump pump is a huge one. If anybody has any questions for Ann, I'm going to leave questions here. Is a question about insurance and any tips on what we need so that we're not surprised regarding not having enough coverage.
So our insurance agency gives us an audit every year, and we answer the questions they ask us. And so Liberty Mutual is who we use in Sanford at the L.B. Goodall Library. And I think Also, if you have a local agent, so we actually get it through a local Garnsey Brothers Insurance, and I think your local expert also will be helpful in guiding you with that. Oh, Natalie, you're muted. Sorry.
It's only been 4.5 years we've been using Zoom. Have any of the libraries been certified through the Sustainable Libraries Initiative? And actually, Rebecca Smith Aldridge and Matt Ballerman from there were our speakers for last year's program. I'm also going to put a link in the chat to the resources, state by state resources that have been put together by the group putting on the Northeast Summit. So I'll add that there. So if anybody is involved with the Sustainable Libraries Initiative, there is a link there. And Meg Backus, who's with the Northern New York 3Rs Council, is also putting a link in the question and answer section for disaster planning for libraries, Friday, October the 4th at 1 p.m. So there is a Zoom link for that. So Meg, thank you for sharing that with us as well. Okay, this question came up about historic buildings, but is anybody interested in working for buildings built specifically for libraries during the age of extreme weather? Interesting thought there. Any thoughts? So our final speaker today is Lawrence Villalago, who is the Director of Risk Management for the Queens Library. He's worked for the Queens Library since 1994 in health safety and risk management, and collaborates with all library departments such as library services, youth and adult programming and services, volunteer programs, technical services, volunteers, outreach, and others. And they review vendor contracts and library program contracts respecting risk transfer and insurance coverage. They also conduct site visits and provide input on policies and programs intended to protect employees, visitors, and contractors, as well as manage insurance and claim programs. And Larry, as you may have seen in the video earlier, shared with us what happened after Superstorm Sandy in Queens, and he has dealt with many weather-related incidents and has had a role in mitigating damage and implementing preparation programs and prevention programs. So Larry, I will throw to you.
All right, well, thank you, Natalie. So I'm just gonna try and share my screen for a second. And let's see. So this here was the old Elmhurst Library where we had a hurricane situation and the trees came toppling down. This library no longer exists. They replaced it with a newer library.
Larry, if you're sharing the screen, we can't see it yet.
Oh, okay. What am I doing wrong? Let's see. Can you see it now?
Not yet, no.
Okay, then I'm just gonna wing it.
Okay.
This way I don't waste everybody's time.
Appreciate it, thank you.
Get rid of that. And put this back on. Okay, so can you see and hear me?
I can see you and I can hear you, yes.
Okay, good. All right, so I work basically for an extremely large system. It is a nonprofit, a 501, but it's also quasi-municipal. We get, I would guess, upwards of 125 million from the city. And then, from the feds and state, there's other funding, private funding. We have 66 locations across 178 square miles in the county of Queens. We have 1,500 employees. We range from basically old Carnegie buildings to brand new buildings like Hunters Point and Far Rockaway that was just built. I've been here over 30 years, dealing with all sorts of disasters from water-related disasters, fire disasters, the pandemic, which I include as a disaster because we had to close all our buildings. But on the climate side, we are surrounded by water on the north side and the south side. And I was looking at Sean's information before for that big rainstorm. The north side of Queens by LaGuardia Airport got 6.5 inches, while the south side of Queens got 2.5 inches. During Sandy, there was really no rain, but we had 5 buildings get 6 feet of water in them. So we virtually went in with bulldozers and started cleaning out buildings. So in my experience, the issues in Queens are sea level on the shore, high water tables in the middle, because a lot of Queens, especially where the airports are built and Lefrak City, Middle Village, they were swamps at one time and were built on swamps and marsh. We do get some torrential rain. We've had to deal with sewers and obstructions or a lack of capacity, where we actually had to meet with the DEP. We opened up some sewer gratings, I'll call them, and we were finding bicycles and carriages and all sorts of stuff, down in the sewer gratings. Power outages. We have buildings shifting, pitching, sinking. We do get some mold. We're getting pests more than ever. So we keep an eye. Lefrak City is one building. I was going to show you some pictures, but Mike can always email those. Lefrak City, we had a building that was sinking a few inches every so often, every time we looked. So we moved into another facility in Lefrak City, and that one actually started flooding. I was around for the first flood and the last flood. First time we were a little green at this, so we extracted 13,000 square feet of carpet, and we, chucked books and equipment, and we ended up buying some new stuff. There was a little bit of an insurance claim. We maintain a $500,000 deductible, so we take a bigger hit than most. But in that building, when we started flooding a lot, we discovered that we had roof drains and sewer drains combined, which you're not allowed to do anymore. So the old construction from the 40s, 50s allowed sewage and roof. It was a rental building, and they had a pump in the garage that never worked. We had some gutters and drains on top of it. We were like in an atrium kind of situation with apartment buildings around us, but the roof would fill up, flat roof, and it would drain into the ground roof drains, and it would come back up through the toilets. So after a few times, and having to stay there for that time being, we took a different approach. I had them cut out the entire building, 4 feet of sheetrock, and we put in cement board. We started running outlets on conduits, above ground as opposed to the in-floor outlets. We ripped out all the rugs and just put down vinyl tile, because that's easier to clean, knowing we would, again, have flooding. We removed storage from the bottom few shelves, and I removed the actual shelving from the last shelf. So in a flood, we could get under the shelf where, little things grow. I also suggested beach furniture, and we did something that was close to beach furniture, but it wouldn't rust. I put some of the bookshelves, like A-frames that we're all familiar with, I put those up on wheels. So we really did quite a bit to kind of prevent our staff from having to really go through that every time. We do have contractors on retainer, I guess we'll call them requirements contractors. So during Sandy, there is no emergency plan for that. You know, we had to wing it. And we called in our cleaning contractors and our general contractors, and we had them bring in bulldozers and 10, 20-yard dumpsters. And in that kind of flooding, you know, we got 6 feet of seawater, and Broad Channel is on the canal. So we had oil and all sorts of stuff. Basically, everything had to be chucked and gutted. And unfortunately, it was, 2 of the buildings had just been renovated. So we had to actually renovate again. You know, and we had some insurance. You know, originally I was told we have no insurance, but I had inland marine coverage, and we were able to collect $3.5 million. FEMA, I think, bucked up 3.5, and we had a lot of private donations and money coming in from all sorts of places. But initially, the insurance company said we had no coverage. And then as I kept pressing, then they said, well, you have 5 deductibles of $500,000, and it was one occurrence. So ultimately, it was one occurrence for $500,000, and we collected on all 5 buildings. It's like buying a used car when you're dealing with insurance. You know, you really have to know your stuff to maintain coverage. So so we were able, you know, to be made partially whole, you know, and then in later renovations, we decided less books, you know, we would put in, and more computers, because basically at this point, the library, even though our website says we're more than books, I like to say we're not your grandmother's library. You know, we have social services, community programs, cultural events, we're cooling and heating centers. You know, so we try to make it such that, you know, we're always available. You know, so during Sandy, you know, we like the video said, you guys should watch the video. We were open the next week in Far Rock. The city gave us a generator. You know, within a few weeks, we had some electricity and lighting in there. We brought in trailers. We brought in book buses. You know, within weeks we were up and running. We had the guy, you know, everybody cleared out all the sand that was all over the place. Some of the buildings had the boardwalk, the Rockaway Beach boardwalk was inside the library, as were these huge fish and everything else you could think of. You know, and we lost everything from adult services records like GED, children's toys and games, custodial equipment, supplies. You know, so I always think, make sure you know what you have, so if you lose it, you can actually account for it. So going forward, you know, we're trying to, I guess, anticipate. Like, we have one building that's going up now in Rosedale, and we're looking at how the construction is going to battle the elements. You know, we're in a high water table. We've had mold and water in the basement for the 30 years that I'm here. We're going to build an extension on the back, you know, but they're going to dig down and waterproof and possibly coat with something over the lower level, which was a staff room and a boiler room. You know, they're going to look at the drainage around the building and you know, do some pumps. Some of the buildings are green. You know, they come with their own issues. Like we have a green building where it's glass pavers around the building, and I had vehicles drive up and the tires went into the lower level. You know, so now you have water penetrating there. You know, so you solve one problem, you create another, usually based on what I've seen. So when we are closed down, we do go remote. We do have the capability. We're on the cloud, you know, and we have to kind of think about, you know, if we're remote, how do we handle staff injury and things like that? You know, we connect with local, state, and federal response teams, and you know, our staff came in during Sandy, like, immediately, and they wanted to help, and they wanted to help the community. And we were sending food, we were sending water, We were sending in, we were setting up for information for customers. We were actually holding programs outside the building when it was nice out, reading programs for kids. We had to drive to Connecticut to gas up our vehicles. So you have to think about stuff like that. Make sure we had, we have the trades, like I was saying before, requirements. During the hurricane, when the big trees come down, we go to the landscapers right away. The HVAC folks come in and, we remediated some of it ourselves where we, knew we had mold and spores. We got air scrubbers in and we created containment in certain areas where people were working, and we upgraded our filters on our internal system. Then we would put up pop-up tents or buses and trailers again, to handle programming when there is no building. But Queens, it's a large community. I think of about 2.5 to 3 million, but pre-COVID, we had 10 million people walking through the door each year. Post-COVID, it's about 60% of that, about 5 to 6 million. And in the 6 buildings that went underwater during Sandy, that's about 350,000 or so folks that go in and out of those doors. So we had to make sure we could get each of those buildings open as soon as we could. They were all in the same general area. And we actually had to pick which buildings to do first because we didn't have the resources to get to all 6. So we made some decisions and we got cracking, and we were all out there all the time during Sandy. But we do have flooding now and then at different buildings, but nothing like Sandy. And I'm a Rockaway kid, so I've spent my whole life in the Rockaways on the beach, and to see the boardwalk move 2 blocks and go into the library was quite a scene. But I guess that's it for me, really. If anybody has any questions or they want any information, I'd be free to share that.
Thank you, Larry. That's really helpful. I mean, you're dealing with not just one building, but multiple buildings, trying to repair them simultaneously, and that's a big undertaking for any library. If anybody has any questions for Larry, before we wrap up, I will say everybody who's registered for today's program will get a copy of the recording that will be sent to them in the next couple of days from the New Jersey State Library. I have listed in the chat the email addresses of our participants who have been very gracious with sharing their time today. We will look to get copies of the slides from everyone to try to send those out to the registrants as well. And we're very appreciative of you spending an hour and a half of your day with us. I'd like to thank all of our panelists, Amy, Ann, Dan, Carolyn, Larry, to my coordinators, Michelle and Deborah, from the New Jersey and Maine State Libraries, respectively. I would like to say thank you very much, and stay tuned to your email to find out more about our February 4th, 2025 program. Thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon.